Welcome back. We are reading The Sisters Grimm, the Fairy Tale Detective. Okay, right? So let's just kind of talk about what just happened. So we have Daphne and we have Sabrina, right? Sabrina's the older one. She's around 11 years old, almost 12. Daphne's 7. And their parents went missing. So they had been in foster homes from time to time. And now they ended up being with this woman who claims to be her grandmother Grimm. But they think that the grandma's dead. So they don't think this woman is actually the grandmother. So right now they just got to the house and they're looking all around at the pictures and things are being kind of weird. They have weird books and stuff like how to cook dragon and things like that. So Sabrina is the cynical one, right? Cynical means she's very like second guessing everything. She's like, I don't think that these people are who they say they are. And Daphne is the 7-year-old and she's just kind of living life. She's just going for it and, so here we go. Daphne was just as distracted, and when they arrived back in the living room, she walked over to a picture and looked at it closely. That was your Opa, Basil, Mrs. Grimm said wistfully. Opa? Daphne asked. Grandfather, Liebling. He passed on about 11 years ago, she said. Is that your baby? Daphne said. The old lady smiled and studied the picture as if she weren't sure. That's your papa, she said with a smile. The little girl eyed the photo closely, but Sabrina turned away. Babies all looked the same. An old photo couldn't prove anything. Oh, I've forgotten the cookies, said the old woman as she dashed to the kitchen. In no time, she returned with a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies. Daphne, of course, happily grabbed one and took a bite. These taste just like my mommy's, she exclaimed. Where did you get the recipe? Where do you think she got the recipe, Angel? Mrs. Grimm said. Sabrina refused to take a cookie, giving Mrs. Grimm an I know what you're up to look. She wasn't going to be bribed with sweets. Just then, Mr. Canis walked in the room. I was about to introduce the girls to Elvis, Mrs. Grimm said to him. Mr. Canis gave a slight smile, nodded, and walked them towards the door. That's a weird man, Sabrina thought as she noted 2 loud creaks in the middle of the living room floor. Is he your boyfriend? Daphne asked the old woman, who was trying to balance the plate of cookies on top of 2 uneven stacks of books. Mrs. Grimm blushed and giggled. Oh dear, no, Mr. Canis and I are not courting. We are just good friends, she said. What does courting mean? Daphne asked her sister. It's an old-fashioned word for dating, Sabrina replied. Suddenly, there was a great rumbling in the house. Books fell from the shelves and windows shook in their frames, and the tray of cookies slid to the floor before the old woman could catch it. And then something enormous came charging through the room and at them. It moved so quickly, Sabrina couldn't tell what it was. It pushed over lamps and chairs and leaped over an ottoman and knocked the terrified girls to the ground. Sabrina screamed. Sure, they were about to be eaten when, much to her surprise, a gooey tongue licked her face. She opened her eyes and looked up at the friendly face of a giant dog. Elvis, please get off of them, Mrs. Grimm said, half commanding and half laughing at the Great Dane. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever seen Great Danes, but these dogs are huge, like mini horses. I mean, not as big as a mini horse, but He gets very excited around new people. The enormous dog gave one last lick to Sabrina's face, leaving a long trail of drool before sitting down next to the old woman, panting and wagging his immense tail. This is Elvis. He's a member of our little family and completely harmless if he likes you, said Mrs. Grimm, scratching the beast on his immense head. Now, immense is big. The dog licked the old woman on the cheek. And if he doesn't? Sabrina asked as she climbed to her feet. The old woman ignored her question. Daphne, on the other hand, jumped up and threw her arms around the dog. Oh, I love him. He's so cute. She laughed as she covered the dog with her own kisses. This is the only boyfriend I have, Mrs. Grimm smiled, and probably the smartest one I've ever had too. Watch. Daphne stepped back, and she and Sabrina watched as Mrs. Grimm put her hand out to Elvis. Elvis, shake, she said, and the dog reached out a huge forepaw and placed it in her hand. Daphne giggled. Play dead, Daphne said hopefully, and the dog fell stiffly over onto his side. The impact dislodged several books from the nearby shelf. Mrs. Grimm laughed. You two must be starving after your trip. I suppose I better get started with dinner. I hope spaghetti and meatballs is okay. I love spaghetti and meatballs, Daphne cried as Elvis gave her a fresh lick. I know you do, Mrs. Grimm said with a wink. She disappeared into the kitchen where she began rattling pots and pans. I don't like this at all, Daphne, Sabrina said as she wiped off the last of the dog's goo. Don't get used to this place. We're not going to be here long. Stop being a snot, Daphne said as she laid a huge smooch on Elvis. Snot was her favorite word lately. She wouldn't hurt us. She's so nice. That's what crazy people are, so dangerous. You think they're nice until they're chaining you up in the garage, Sabrina replied. And I am not being a snot. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are, Daphne insisted. Anything is better than living at that orphanage, right? Daphne did have a point. Sabrina walked over and examined the photograph the old woman claimed was the girl's father. The rosy-cheeked baby in the photo seemed to stare back at her. Mr. Canis had cleared the big oak dining room table of enough books for everyone to eat comfortably. He had left an exceptionally thick volume entitled Architecture for Pigs on Daphne's chair so the little girl could reach her dinner. As they waited patiently for Mrs. Grimm, who was still making a thunderous racket in the kitchen, Mr. Canis closed his eyes and sat silently. Soon his stillness began to unnerve Sabrina. Was he mute? Was there something wrong with him? In New York City, everyone talked, or rather everyone yelled at everyone all the time. They never sat quietly with their eyes closed, and when people were around, it was rude. I think he's dead, Daphne whispered after staring at him for some time. Suddenly, Mrs. Grimm came through the door with a big copper pot and placed it on the table. She rushed back into the kitchen and returned with a plate of salad and sat in front of Mr. Canis. As soon as the plate hit the table, the old man opened his eyes and began to eat. How did you know I like spaghetti? It's my favorite, Daphne said happily. I know a lot of things about you, Liebling. I am your Oma, Mrs. Grimm replied. Oma? Sabrina asked. What's this weird language you keep speaking? It means grandmother in German. That's where our family is from, Mrs. Grimm answered. My family is from New York City, Sabrina said stiffly. The old woman smiled a sad smile. Your mama sent me letters from time to time. I know a great deal about you both. In fact, when I stopped getting them, I knew, she sighed. That they'd abandoned us? Sabrina snapped. Suddenly, Sabrina felt as she might burst into tears. She ducked her head, fighting their escape down her cheeks. Child, your mother and father didn't abandon you, Mrs. Grimm said. Mrs. Grimm, Daphne began. Liebling, I'm not Mrs. Grimm. I'm your grandmother, the old woman said. You can call me Grandma or Oma, but never Mrs. Grimm, please? Can we call you Granny? I always wanted a granny, said Daphne. Sabrina kicked her sharply under the table, and the little girl winced. Of course, I'll be your Granny Relda, the old woman said with a smile as she took the top of the pot off. Sabrina stared inside. She had never seen spaghetti like this. The noodles were black and the sauce was a bright orange color. It smelled both sweet and spicy at the same time, and the meatballs, which were emerald green, were surely not made from the kind of meat Sabrina had ever had. It's a special recipe, said Mrs. Grimm as she dished some out for Daphne. The sauce had a little curry in it, and the noodles are made with squid ink. Sabrina was disgusted. There was no way she was going to eat the old woman's weird food. This sicko had lied about being someone's dead grandmother. Who knew what had yanked from under the kitchen sink and added to the recipe? Arsenic, rat poison, clog remover? No, Sabrina wasn't going to eat a noodle. Of course, Daphne dug in with gusto and had already swallowed a third of her plate before Sabrina could warn her. So Mr. Canis says your suitcases felt almost empty. Don't you have any clothes? Mrs. Grimm asked. The police kept them, Daphne said, shoveling a huge forkful of noodles into her mouth. They said they were evidence. Kept them? That's crazy. What will you do? What would they do with them? She looked at each of them and finally at Mr. Canis, who shrugged. Well, we have to go into town and pick you out new wardrobes. We can't have you running around naked all the time, can we? I mean, people will think we're nudists. Daphne laughed to the point of snorting, but when she saw Sabrina's disapproving face, she stopped and stuck her tongue out at her sister. I was thinking that Mrs. Grimm started, but Sabrina interrupted. Who are you? And don't say you're our grandmother, because our grandmother is dead. Mrs. Grimm shifted in her seat. Mr. Canis, obviously seeing the question as his cue to retire, got up, took his empty plate, and exited the room. But I am your grandmother, Liebling, the old woman replied. I said our grandmother is dead. Our father told us that she is dead and that she died before we were born. Girls, I assure you that I am who I say I am. Well, then why did he tell us you died if you didn't? I'm not sure it is time to discuss your father's decisions. We are all just getting settled in, and we can talk about it later, Mrs. Grimm said. Her eyes dropped to her lap. Well, if you really were our grandmother, I would think you'd be happy to discuss it, Sabrina snapped. Now is not the time, said Mrs. Grimm softly. Sabrina leaped up from her seat, sending her fork clanging to the floor. Fine! I'm tired and I want to go to bed. Mrs. Grimm frowned. Of course, Liebling, your room is upstairs. I will show it to you. We'll find it ourselves! Sabrina grabbed Daphne's hand and dragged her from her chair. But I'm not done eating, said Daphne. You're never done eating. Let's go, Sabrina commanded. She marched through the house and up the stairs with her sister in tow. At the top of the stairs, they found a long hallway with 5 closed doors, 2 on each side and 1 at the end of the hallway. Sabrina yanked on the closest door, but it was locked. She turned and tried the door behind it. It opened to a bedroom, decorated with dozens of wooden tribal masks, wild-eyed and smiling hideously. 2 ancient swords were mounted on the wall alongside the masks, and there were pictures of Mrs. Grimm and her husband, Basil, everywhere, like the one downstairs. Each photo was a different part of the world. In one picture, Basil was standing at the top of an ancient stone temple. In another, the couple were guiding a gondola through what Sabrina guessed were Venetian canals. She closed the door, realizing that this had to be the old woman's room. She tried the next door. Inside, Mr. Canis sat cross-legged on the floor, his hands resting on his knees. Several candles lit the nearly empty room, illuminating its sparse furnishings, and a small woven mat on the floor. There were no pictures or decorations at all. Mr. Canis opened his eyes and turned to look at the girls. His eyebrows arched. Sabrina slammed the door without apologizing. What a nutcase, she muttered. The next door opened to a queen-sized 4-poster bed with their suitcases resting on top. Sabrina pulled Daphne inside and slammed the door. That woman is hiding something, she said. You think everyone's hiding something, and you would hug the devil if he gave you cookies. Well, I like her, said Daphne. She sat down on the bed and let out a humph. Sabrina looked around the room. It was painted in a soft yellow and had slanted ceilings and a fireplace. A red 10-speed bicycle sat in the corner, an old baseball mitt rested on a desk, and several model airplanes hung from the ceiling. A nightstand sat next to the bed with an alarm clock perched on top, and on every wall were dozens of old photographs. A particularly large one showed 2 young boys staring out over the Hudson River. Sabrina went to the window and looked out at the porch roof below. She could probably jump off of it and then to the ground, but Daphne might hurt herself. Let's give her a chance, Daphne begged. A chance to what? Kill us in our sleep? Feed us to the monster dog of hers? No way, Sabrina said. While you were shoveling in those meatballs, did you think that they might be made from the last couple of kids she claimed she was related to? Daphne rolled her eyes. You're gross. Suddenly, Sabrina heard a faint whistling sound, almost like a flute, coming from outside the window. She peered into the dark forest behind the house. At first, she thought she had seen something, or someone sitting in a tree, but then she rubbed her eyes for a clearer look. There was nothing there. Still, the music continued. Where was that coming from? She said, and like an answer to her question, a light flickered outside the window. Sabrina thought it was a lightning bug. It flew up to the window as if it were trying to get a better view of her. It was joined by another light, and the 2 danced around each other, zipping excitedly back and forth in the air. Amazing, she said. Daphne rushed to the window. Oh, they're so pretty, she whispered as dozens more lights joined the original two. Within seconds, there were almost 100 little lights blinking and flashing outside. Without thinking, Sabrina reached up and unlocked the window. She just wanted to get a little closer to look, maybe grab a couple to keep in a jar, but as she undid the window's latch, the bedroom door blew open with a crash. Startled, the sisters spun around and found Mr. Candace looming in the doorway. Girls, you leave that window closed if you know what's good for you, he growled. That was the end. What do you think it was? All those lights? Is Mrs. Grimm really the grandma? Will Daphne and Sabrina try to escape? What were the meatballs really made of the children that she had last claimed? Just kidding. We don't know if she claimed other children. That was just Sabrina saying stuff. Well, I have a lot of questions, but we are going to have to wait to see chapter 2. Bye.